The forest on Orinel 3 looked almost gentle from the air, a rippling blanket of emerald and gold that stretched between black basalt ridges. But as the shuttle dropped through the morning haze, Mark saw how deceptive that softness was. The canopy formed uneven waves of needle leaves, broken by jagged stone spires and patches of pale mist where spores drifted like low clouds. Every survival instructor at the Galactic Academy loved this place. Every cadet who had actually set foot on it hated it. The shuttle touched down in a clearing of flattened glassy soil where previous landings had fused sand and ash into a smooth crater. The door hissed open with a breath of cold, spore-scented air that carried a faint metallic tang. Mark stepped out last, squinting against the diffuse light that filtered through the high canopy. Around him, a dozen alien cadets fanned out, stretching limbs, checking gear, adjusting enviro harnesses and portable scanners. Armor plates clicked, translucent fins unfurled, and chitinous fingers ran across holsters and readout panels. Mark had nothing but the standard Academy survival kit and his own 2 boots. He tugged his pack straps tighter and tried not to look impressed by the others' equipment. An instructor in slate-gray armor waited at the center of the clearing. The being's species came from high-gravity worlds and had 4 jointed legs and 2 powerful arms folded behind a barrel-shaped torso. A thin translator collar pulsed at the side of the instructor's thick neck as he, or perhaps it, regarded the cadets with reflective black eyes. Next to the instructor stood a tall, hollow projector, currently dark, its surface beaded with condensed moisture. "Cadets," the instructor began, voice emerging as a precise neutral baritone from the collar. "Welcome to the tracking module of your interspecies survival course." A faint murmur moved through the group as everyone shifted closer. The ground here was deceptively simple. A layer of brittle, scale-like leaf fragments over dark soil, interrupted by twisted roots and clusters of rubbery moss. Mark tested it with his boot and watched how the fragments broke, how the underlying soil compacted, how quickly the surface seemed to settle. The instructor tapped a control on a wristband, and the hollow projector came to life. A rotating 3-dimensional image of a sleek, quadrupedal creature flickered above the pedestal. It had a low, muscular body, an elongated neck, and a head like a cross between a cat and a crocodile, with crystalline ridges along the spine that caught the greenish light. "This is your target," the instructor said. "Local designation, glider predator. You will know it as Test Subject 7. Herbivores flee from it, and most cadets fail because they assume footprints will be obvious. You will soon discover that this assumption is incorrect." One of the cadets, a slim, iridescent being with a crest of shimmering feathers, lifted a hand. "Our scanners can compensate for ambient radiation. We will detect heat traces," she said confidently. The instructor's head tilted. "You may attempt that, Cadet Risaya." Another cadet, whose body was covered in dark scale plates that overlapped like armor, thumped his chest. "My species can follow scent trails for days. No creature erases chemical signatures faster than we can read them," he boasted. A few others nodded, the gesture taking different forms depending on necks and joints, but the meaning was the same: confidence. Mark did not say anything. He studied the hollow of the creature instead, watching the smooth movement of its simulated gait. The projection showed no heavy, stamping motion, no deep impact. The paws were broad and flexible, the digits long, adapted for spreading weight and gripping uneven stone. He imagined those paws pressing into this forest floor, touching the brittle fragments and elastic moss, lifting again. How much of a mark would remain? The instructor seemed to notice his focus. The barrel-shaped body turned slightly, black eyes reflecting the hollow light. "Human Mark Lyle," the instructor said, the name crisp in the air. "You have no advanced sensory organs. Your technology is limited to the standard scanner. Do you anticipate difficulty?" A few cadets glanced at Mark, some with curiosity, some with faint amusement. Mark shrugged one shoulder. "I anticipate work," he answered. His breath puffed in the cool air, curled, and vanished. "Good," the instructor said. "You will need it." The hollow vanished, leaving the group standing in a circle on bare, glassy ground. The instructor gestured outward, toward the forest that ringed the clearing like a wall. "The glider Predator has been released. It departed from this clearing 1 standard hour ago. Your objective? Locate it using any lawful methods available to you. You may not use orbital imaging, drones, or airborne tracking units. Ground-bound scanners only. You will work in mixed species teams of 3. Return here once you have visual contact with the target. If you become lost, activate your emergency beacon. Failing this module will not result in expulsion. It will, however, result in remedial training which none of you want." A ripple of dry amusement passed through a few cadets. The instructor's translator did not change tone, but the pause held the weight of long experience. Team assignments flashed across each cadet's wrist display. Mark glanced down at his. He had been placed with Risaya, the feather-crested scent skeptic with advanced scanners, and with a heavy-set, four-eyed cadet whose species evolved in subterranean caverns. The cavern-born cadet's pupils were wide and ringed with reflective tissue. His eyes seemed to drink in every photon. He introduced himself as Joran, voice low and rough. "I will see undergrowth shifts from meters away," Joran said, adjusting a visor that boosted contrast and highlighted motion. "Between my eyes and Risaya's scanners, we will find this creature before any other team." Risaya rolled her shoulders, feathers rustling with metallic sound. "Agreed," she said, then looked at Mark. "You may handle terrain safety and timekeeping, human. Your species is reputed for endurance. That will be useful if this takes hours." The words were not unkind, but they assigned him a role before he had said anything about what he could do. Mark just nodded. "Fine by me," he said. Inside, he felt an old, familiar sensation, the weight of being underestimated. He had felt it on the station's zero-G course, when long-limbed aquatic cadets presumed he would flail in mid-air. He had felt it during the toxic chemical identification test, when the silicon-based life forms assumed an oxygen breather would never memorize volatile compounds as quickly as they could. He had passed those tests by watching, by listening, by noticing details no one else bothered to see. He planned to do the same here. Teams spread out toward the edge of the clearing, stepping from smooth, glassy ground onto the brittle leaf fragments. The first steps produced sharp, dry crunches that sounded incredibly loud after the soft hum of the shuttle. Risaya lifted her scanner, a compact device with a fan of protruding antennae and a pale blue hollow readout. Numbers scrolled as she swept the area. "Residual heat signatures are almost gone," she said, frowning. "The creature's body dissipates heat at a remarkable rate." "Then scent," Joran suggested. "Your device can isolate chemical trails." Risaya adjusted settings, and a cascade of colored streams flowed across the hollow, mapping airborne and ground-level compounds. She studied them, crest feathers flattening. "The forest is saturated with spores and aromatic oils," she murmured. "Every plant is screaming into the air. The creature's scent is not distinct enough to isolate at this range. We must move outward." Mark crouched near the boundary between glass and natural ground. He ignored the scanner's numbers and instead looked at how the transition had been disturbed. The clearing's fused surface ended in a jagged edge, where the glass met soil. A multitude of small impacts radiated outward. Cadet footprints, instructor tracks, maintenance bots. Underneath those fresh disturbances lay older impressions from prior exercises. It was chaos. Yet somewhere, an hour earlier, a glider predator had jumped from this smooth surface to the forest floor. It had gone first, before any cadet today. That first departure must have disturbed pristine leaf fragments. Mark's gaze drifted left, then right, absorbing textures rather than shapes. On the left, he saw clusters of broken fragments crushed deep, as if something heavy had pushed off hard. On the right, he saw a subtle smear where the top layer of fragments had shifted but not shattered, the dark soil barely visible beneath. He shifted his weight, recreating the action in his mind. A creature with low, springy body mass launching into the undergrowth, careful not to sink. "An hour ago, no one walked here," he said quietly. "The first disturbance near the edge that is not part of the old impact pattern will be the predator." "What?" Risaya asked, distracted by her scrolling data. Joran turned his 4 eyes toward Mark. "Explain." Mark pointed at the left side. "Those deep breaks look old. The fragments have started to settle into the soil again. See how the dust has collected along the edges?" He moved his hand to the right. "Here, the fragments are lighter in color where they snapped. Less dust. That is newer. Look at the direction of the fracture edges." Risaya knelt beside him, peering at the ground. Her feathers shifted in faint irritation. "Our scanners log time-stamped disturbances, human. We do not need to guess from color." Mark smiled slightly. "Your scanner is not measuring each leaf fragment," he said. "It is giving you sums. The ground is stories, not numbers." He touched the edge of one broken fragment with a gloved finger. It flaked, showing fresh pale tissue underneath darker weathered surface. "This was broken recently," he added, "and something pushed off that way." He extended his finger toward a stand of bulbous trees whose roots twisted above the soil like knotted muscles. Joran frowned, then adjusted his visor to a different spectrum. "I see compressed zones," he admitted after a moment. "Light scattering patterns are different. The human is correct. Something moved that way." Risaya hesitated, then swept her scanner in the direction Mark indicated. Faint, decaying heat signatures appeared, almost lost in background noise. "Minimal confirmation," she said grudgingly. "Not enough for an automated lock, but present." Mark straightened and hoisted his pack. "Then that is our starting line," he said. The forest seemed to lean toward them as they approached, branches arching low, fronds nodding in a breeze that barely reached the ground. The first true steps into it felt like crossing a boundary not just in space but in expectations. Around the clearing, other teams plunged into different sections, confident in their own methods. Mark could hear fragments of conversation, scanner pings, and the soft hum of powered boots. One cadet laughed, voice echoing briefly, then vanishing in the dense undergrowth. The instructor remained by the hollow pedestal, watching in silence, unreadable. Mark's team stepped between the first bulging roots. The ground changed immediately. Instead of brittle fragments, his boots sank slightly into a springy mat of moss and decomposed matter. Above, the canopy filtered light into greenish beams that mottled every surface. The air grew cooler and thicker with the scent of earth and resin. Risaya moved ahead, scanner raised, crest glowing faintly. Joran walked on her left, helmet visor shifting through contrast modes. Mark slipped into position on the right, close to the trunks where shadows pooled deepest. His eyes were not specialized for low light or expanded wavelengths, but he had grown up in forests on Earth, learning to notice small things. A bent blade of grass, a stone rotated half a turn, the way disturbed soil held moisture differently from untouched ground. On Orinel 3, everything was alien, yet patterns of disruption still existed. When something large moved, the world made room, and that room looked different afterward. Behind them, the clearing and the shuttle and the sense of open space felt already distant, swallowed by the undergrowth. The challenge had begun. Somewhere ahead, a glider predator had walked through this forest without leaving a single clear footprint. The Academy believed no species could track it without technology. Mark intended to prove that belief wrong, one broken fragment and disturbed patch of moss at a time. Risaya advanced through the undergrowth with her scanner held high, its thin antennae trembling as it searched for anything that resembled a readable signature. Joran followed slightly behind her, his 4 eyes scanning the dim forest, each pair shifting focus independently as he searched for any movement that might betray the glider predator's route. Mark moved more slowly than both of them, not because he was hesitant, but because he was paying attention to things neither of his teammates thought were relevant. Every patch of moss, every branch, every fallen needle leaf seemed to hold a piece of information, waiting for the right observer to interpret it. The forest deepened around them. The light, filtered through layer upon layer of tangled canopy, grew thinner and more green-tinted. Risa kept her scanner angled forward, the pale holographic display casting an artificial glow across her high cheekbones and crest feathers. Her brows tightened as the unit continued to show no useful information. She flicked through modes, thermal, chemical, magnetic, but nothing produced more than a faint haze of background signals. The forest's natural emissions drowned out anything meaningful. Spores drifted constantly, their temperature only marginally different from the air. Chemical vapors rose from nearly every plant, and the magnetic fields beneath the soil fluctuated with the slow shifting of mineral-rich roots. Joran lowered his head to peer at a cluster of thorny vines that curled around a pair of tree trunks. Under certain light angles, the vines shimmered. "No displacement," he said. His deep voice vibrated through his chest as he straightened. "Nothing moved through here in the last hour." Risa let out a sharp breath. "That cannot be right. The creature should have traveled in a straight line before changing direction. We should have detected something. A trace, a micro-disturbance, anything." Mark knelt beside a patch of moss that stretched across the forest floor like a soft green carpet. The moss here was springy and thick, but something about a few sections stood out. He brushed a fingertip lightly across the surface. Some strands were upright, untouched, but in a subtle pattern, barely noticeable, other strands were pressed at slight angles, not fully flattened, not torn, but leaning in the same direction as if something had brushed past them. "Maybe we are looking for the wrong kind of trace," Mark said calmly. Risa did not look at him. "Unless the wrong kind is the right kind, human, this is not helpful." She tapped her scanner again with growing frustration. "There is nothing. No thermal bleed, no scent thread, not a single electromagnetic irregularity that correlates with the target's biology. This entire environment overwhelms the device." "That is exactly why you should not rely on the device," Mark said. He stood, brushing dirt from his knee. "You want the forest to tell you numbers, but the forest is not speaking in numbers. It is speaking in changes." Jorun turned toward him. All four of his dark rings caught what little light filtered through the canopy. "Explain the changes." Mark gestured toward the patch of moss. "Look closely. Some strands are tilted, slightly, in the same direction." Risa finally crouched beside him, her crest feathers flattening as she inspected the moss. She frowned. "Wind?" "There is no wind here," Mark said. "The canopy is too dense. Air barely moves except in pockets near the ridges." He traced a line through the moss with his finger but did not disturb it. "Something passed through here and brushed the surface. Not stepped, brushed." Joran leaned in, shifting his visor to a contrast enhancement mode. The moss brightened in a soft glow, highlighting angling differences between the strands. "He is right. This is recent." Risa closed her scanner with an irritated flick. "All right. Show us what else you see, then. If the creature avoided leaving deep impressions, we must rely on these softer signs." Mark nodded and began to walk, but not in a straight line. He moved slowly, studying each segment of forest floor as if reading a long text written in a forgotten alphabet. Risa and Joran watched him, gradually falling into silence, the earlier frustration fading into focused curiosity. "Here," Mark murmured after a minute. He pointed at a branch hanging low above the ground. The branch was covered in scale-like leaves, but a few of them were cracked or bent in a different direction. He touched one, showing the clean break at its base. "The break is recent. Less oxidation on the exposed tissue." "So the creature passed and struck it with its body?" Jorun asked. "More like its flank or shoulder," Mark replied. "The glider predator has a low posture. Its body is wide. If it moved quickly, even slightly, it would brush against branches like these." Risa's feathers rustled as she leaned close to inspect the crack. But how do you know it was not just another forest animal? Mark smiled faintly. The height. He pointed lower. Small animals passing under would not reach this branch, and larger ones would break it more violently. This was a glancing impact. Joran grunted approval. That is logical. They continued through the forest, the silence broken only by the soft rustle of Mark shifting leaves with his boot and the quiet chirps of distant tree insects. Risa tried to assist, but her instincts kept drawing her back to her scanner, even though she knew it offered nothing. Joran relied heavily on his enhanced vision modes, yet even he missed several signs until Mark pointed them out. At one point, they reached a fallen tree trunk, its bark peeling in long strips. Mark ran his hand across the surface and stopped. Here. He tapped a section where the moss had been scraped off in a faint arch. The creature slid over this, or stepped across in a way that dragged its body. Risa raised an eyebrow. You are certain? The pattern is smooth, controlled. Nothing else around here matches that body width. The glider predator was becoming more real to her now, not as a hollow diagram, but as a living presence moving through the forest, disturbing it just enough to leave whispers behind. Mark motioned them onward, following a line of broken lichen patches. The lichen grew thick on the sides of many tree trunks, forming pale blue ridges. Some had been smeared or gently torn. He traced those patches like stepping stones. The creature turns here, Mark said. Risa squinted. How do you know? The disturbance changes direction. See? He pointed to a hanging curtain of moss between two trees. A small segment was missing, torn off at an angle. It moved that way. Risa stared for a long moment. You are mapping all of this in your head. Yes, Mark said simply. Joran let out a low breath. My species prides itself on subterranean navigation, but you are reading the surface world with the same skill. It is just practice, Mark said. Forests back home taught me that everything alive leaves a story behind, even when it tries not to. Risa opened her scanner again, but this time she did not rely on its data. She merely used it as a light source while observing the environment with her own eyes. Mark noticed and said nothing. The deeper they went, the quieter the forest became. The usual background hum softened as if the trees themselves were listening. The air thickened with the scent of resin and damp soil. The canopy dimmed, allowing thin beams of greenish brilliance to spill over roots and boulders. Mark stopped suddenly. Risa nearly bumped into him. What is wrong? She whispered. Mark crouched near a gnarled root where something had shifted the soil in a way almost impossible to see. He lifted a tiny ball of moss from the ground. The sphere was compacted, not naturally formed. He squeezed it gently. It separated into strands. The creature stepped here, he said. It pressed moss together with its paw, not enough to leave a footprint, but enough to roll moss into a ball. Risa exhaled in disbelief. How can you notice something that small? When you look for signs, Mark said softly, everything becomes a sign. Joran scanned the surrounding area with wide eyes. The path continues beyond this tree. The branches lower ahead. The creature might have squeezed between the trunks. Mark nodded. Yes, it is narrowing. That means we are close to where it changed pace or direction again. Risa looked around nervously. Do you mean it is near us? Not yet, Mark said, but we are closing the distance. Then he pointed upward. A torn cluster of lichen dangled from a branch high above. It leapt here, a single jump to avoid leaving more ground disturbance. Clever animal. Risa stared upward, shocked. You saw that from down here? No, Mark said with a faint smile. I saw the landing and worked backward. Risa's feathers lifted slightly in reluctant admiration. Joran gave a deep nod. Mark stepped deeper into the forest without breaking pace. He moved with confidence now, reading each tilt of moss, each scraped bark, each broken twig the way another person might read lines of text. The forest, once overwhelming in its density, now seemed to speak to him in quiet, scattered sentences. Risaya finally lowered her scanner completely. She clipped it to her belt. "If you can keep seeing these signs, then guide us. We will follow." Mark nodded, raising his chin toward the darker stretch of forest ahead. "The creature's path is getting fresher. The forest is changing more recently there. Stay close." As the three of them pushed deeper into the dim corridor of twisted roots and hanging moss, Risaya and Joran felt something shift, not in the forest, but in their understanding. For the first time, they realized the difference between data and perception. The forest did not reveal numbers. It revealed stories, and Mark was the only one among them who could read them with absolute clarity. The forest tightened around the trio as Mark led Risaya and Joran deeper into terrain that grew stranger with every step. The trees thickened until their trunks touched one another like the ribs of some colossal creature buried upright beneath the ground. The canopy above twisted into a near-solid mass, blotting out enough sunlight that the group moved in a dim, shifting half-shadow. Risaya lifted one of her handheld lights, but Mark motioned her to lower it. The abrupt brightness would wash out subtle signs. She obeyed reluctantly, dimming the light until it cast only a faint glow over the undergrowth. Mark crouched again, touching a line of moss that wound between two protruding roots. The edge of the moss line was disturbed, barely, but enough for him to see how the strands leaned inward toward a narrow crevice between trunks. He ran his fingers across the disturbed edge, testing texture, softness, and how recently the strands had been pressed. The moss bent with a slight resilience, indicating the pressure applied had been recent and purposeful. He rose without a word and stepped toward the crevice. Risaya stopped him with a hand on his shoulder. Her feathers, glowing faintly with bioluminescent shimmer, reflected her unease. "There could be predators," she warned softly. "Not just the one we are tracking. Orinel 3 is not empty." Mark nodded. "I know. That is why we move quietly. But the creature moved through here." He pointed to the moss trail. "When it passed, it pressed this section more firmly than the others. That means it shifted its weight. Something startled it. Something made it change speed." Jorun scanned the crevice with his enhanced eyes. His pupils expanded and contracted in unusual rhythm as he cycled through vision modes. "Nothing is inside," he said after a few seconds. "No movement. No heat." Mark slipped into the narrow space between the trunks. The others followed, Risaya going second and Joran last, his large footsteps sinking more deeply into the soil. The crevice opened into a small hollow marked by roots that intertwined like a woven barrier. Mark traced a faint scrape on the wood, a long, shallow mark that slanted upward. "It climbed," Mark said quietly. "See the angle? The glider predator pushed itself upward using this route. Something about the ground here made climbing easier than moving ahead." Risaya frowned. "But why would it climb? Is it trying to hide?" Mark stepped back and looked around, calculating angles and lines of sight. "Not to hide, to cross." He pointed above. "Look." Far overhead, a thick branch arced across the hollow like a natural bridge. The bark was smoother in one section, smoother because something had slid along it. The light caught a faint sheen, reflecting where the creature's crystalline spikes along its spine had scraped the surface. Risaya and Joran stared upward, realization dawning. "The creature took the high path," Mark said with certainty. "After something startled it here. It did not want to run on the ground anymore." Joran studied the smooth bark with his visor. "There is residue, organic oils." He paused. "Fresher than the broken leaves we saw earlier." Risaya's voice grew quieter. "We are gaining on it." Mark nodded. "Its signs are becoming closer together. Less time between disturbances." He placed a hand on the trunk, steadying himself as he studied the pattern of broken lichens spiraling upward. It climbed from here. Risaya lifted her foot, considering the ascent. We cannot climb the same way, she said, wings of her crest rippling with frustration. Our bodies are not as flexible, and the branch is too high for a direct jump. We do not need to climb exactly as it did, Mark replied. We only need to follow the most likely landing point. He turned and scanned ahead, narrowing his eyes until he found what he was searching for, a place where a thick cluster of moss on the ground was crushed slightly inward, forming a wide oval. The moss's vibrant green color had dulled where the pressure had been applied, but not yet recovered enough to mask the disturbance. Mark stepped toward it and examined the edges. This is where it landed, he said. The moss is softer here. That means more weight pressed into it. The creature likely landed on all four limbs, spreading its weight but still leaving enough of a sign for us to see. Risaya crouched beside him, studying the crushed moss. But how do you know it did not simply walk over this area earlier today? She asked. Mark pointed to the way the strands were bent. Because the impacts are angled from above, not just compressed downward. The moss spread outward, away from the center. That only happens when something drops onto it from height. Risaya's crest fluttered in awe. You read the ground as if it is speaking aloud. It is, Mark said simply. It always does. Most people just do not listen. Jorun's 4 eyes swept the surrounding trees. If it landed here, then it ran forward again. What should we look for next? Mark scanned the forest floor ahead. Layers of debris lay scattered unevenly, but one pattern stood out. A faint line of leaves overturned, their lighter undersides exposed. He walked toward them, stepping lightly to avoid altering the signs. He crouched again, lifting one of the leaves carefully. A thin smear of soil lay on its underside, rubbed off as it had been flipped. Here's another trail, he said. The creature moved quickly, brushing past leaves and overturning them. It must have increased its speed after landing. Risaya eyed the overturned leaves suspiciously. You make it sound easy. It is not, Mark admitted. It is only clear because we know where the creature landed. From that point, the next change becomes easier to see. The three moved forward again, following the pattern of overturned leaves, broken lichen patches, and scraped bark. The forest opened slightly, revealing a stretch where sunlight filtered down more clearly through a gap in the canopy. The ground here was dotted with patches of thick fern-like plants, their fronds arching outward in elegant spirals. Mark approached the nearest fern and paused. It passed here too. Risaya scanned the plant with her device. There is no heat, no chemical trace. Mark pointed to a single frond bent at an odd angle. The plant was pushed from the side, not by wind or falling debris. The bend is too deliberate and too uniform. Jorun stepped closer. The creature's flank again? Likely, Mark said, though it must have moved faster here. The bend is sharper than the earlier signs. Risaya followed his gaze. She noticed that the fronds on the opposite side of the clearing were disturbed as well, forming a faint path that zigzagged through the patch. It ran erratically, she concluded. Yes, Mark said. The pattern is not straight. Something changed in its behavior again. Jorun stiffened. Do you think it sensed us? Mark shook his head. No. We are still too far for it to detect. Something else influenced its movement. Risaya's feathers ruffled. Another predator? Possibly, Mark said. Or perhaps terrain forced it to adjust. He walked forward, tracing the zigzag pattern until he reached a section of ground marked by several broken branches. He lifted one branch, noting the freshness of the break and the absence of decay along the edges. This is recent. He held the branch horizontally. The creature shifted direction sharply here. That means something blocked its path. Jorun examined the area with his enhanced vision, lowering his head near the soil. The ground rises sharply ahead, he reported. "A rock formation. The creature may have tried to avoid climbing." Mark nodded. Then it moved along the slope instead. The trio followed the path to the rising terrain, where massive boulders jutted from the soil like the ribs of an ancient beast. Risaya frowned. If the predator avoided the rocks, then it stayed low? No, Mark said. It used the rocks differently. He placed a hand on the nearest boulder and pointed to a thin streak of green residue smeared along the surface. It brushed against this stone while moving. The moss from its flank left a trace. That means it passed very close. Risaya approached the smear and stared at the faint green line. So subtle. She touched it and rubbed her fingers. Still moist. Very fresh. Joran's voice lowered. We are very close. Mark scanned the forest ahead, now on high alert. The signs were tighter, fresher, more frequent. It slowed down here, he said. Its steps became smaller. It turned its head repeatedly. Risaya tensed. How can you know that? Mark pointed to the scratched bark on two opposite trunks. It looked around. Those scratches are from its crystalline ridges. It must have been assessing the area. Joran took a careful breath. Then we must proceed cautiously. Mark nodded, leading them around the rocks, deeper into the forest. The air cooled again. The light dimmed. The forest floor grew softer, covered in a thicker layer of moss. A hush fell around them. Mark stopped. Risaya froze behind him, feathers raised. Joran lowered into a half-crouch, muscles tensed. Mark pointed ahead to a series of moss patches. The moss here was flattened in a controlled, deliberate pattern, long parallel impressions made by something lowering its body slowly. The glider predator had rested here, and not long ago. Mark turned to his team. We have closed the distance. We are entering its resting zone. From here on, it might detect us. Risaya swallowed, crest flickering nervously. Then what now? Mark looked at the deepening forest ahead, where the moss shone faintly like a carpet kissed by emerald light. Now, he said, we read the final traces carefully. The creature is no longer running. It is choosing its path. He stepped forward, and 3 cadets moving deeper into the heart of Orinel 3's labyrinthine wilderness, closer than any cadets had ever come to finding the elusive glider predator without technology. The forest shifted as the trio moved beyond the predator's resting zone. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable except to someone who was studying the surroundings with Mark's level of awareness. The trees grew taller but thinner, their spiral-shaped roots rising from the soil like twisted sculptures. Pockets of pale mist drifted between the trunks, clinging to low branches and lingering there as if reluctant to disperse. Each step carried them deeper into a region where the air felt colder and the light dimmer, despite the thinning canopy. Mark slowed his pace. He kept his fingers raised slightly, brushing the air, feeling the temperature shifts that clung to pockets of moss and stone. Risaya and Joran followed closely behind him, their earlier confidence replaced by quiet intensity. Both had begun to understand that the forest offered its secrets only to those willing to observe, not demand. The faint, sharp movements in Risaya's crest feathers showed her alertness. Joran's breathing had deepened as he pushed his senses to their limits, straining to pick up any sound beyond their quiet steps. Mark stopped near a wide trunk split into 3 rising spirals. The bark was rough, covered in ridges that curled outward like coiled vines. Something about one ridge drew his attention. He touched the curling bark gently. A layer of pale dust clung to the surface, dust that had been disturbed recently. The glider predator must have brushed against it, leaving a faint smear where its body pressed lightly. It passed here, Mark said softly. Risaya approached, but this time she did not raise her scanner. She traced the disturbed ridge thoughtfully, her feathers dimming in acknowledgement. It brushed against this side, and the angle... She pointed to the lower portion of the bark, where a few scratches angled diagonally upward. Means it was turning. Mark gave a nod. Yes, it slowed as it approached this area. Not because it was tired. Its resting zone was behind us. Something ahead caused it to move carefully. Joran knelt and pressed a hand to the ground. His broad fingertips brushed across tiny fragments of dry leaves that formed a thin, fragile layer atop the moss. The pieces here are less broken. Something heavier did not move through, he observed. Not heavier, Mark corrected. Just cautious. It lifted its paws carefully. It wanted to make less noise. Risa's eyes widened. Noise? But what would a glider predator fear here? Mark walked around the three-spiraled trunk, following the faint swirl of moss disturbed on the opposite side. Fear is not the right word. Wariness, maybe. It approached something unusual or dangerous, something it did not want to startle. Joran's deep voice rumbled. Another predator? Possibly, Mark said, or something valuable to it. The trio moved forward cautiously. As they stepped around a dense patch of hanging vines, the forest suddenly opened into a wider clearing. This one was different from the open spaces near the landing site. The trunks surrounding it were arranged in a ring, whether naturally or by some ancient geological pattern, Mark could not tell. Their roots spiraled outward, weaving into one another until they formed something like a natural wall. The inside of the ring was carpeted with a thick layer of moss that glowed faintly with luminescent spores, giving the clearing a soft, greenish illumination. Risa inhaled sharply. This place, it feels alive. Joran nodded slowly. There is no wind, yet the moss trembles. Mark saw it too. The faint movement, as if something had passed not long ago and set everything into slow motion that had not fully settled. He approached the moss carefully, noticing how its surface held lines, long, shallow lines running in arcs. He knelt beside one. These are drag marks, he said. Risa knelt beside him. From the creature? No, Mark said. From its tail. Look at the spacing. It moved around the clearing in a circle. Jorun's gaze swept the ring of trees. Why circle? To mask its direction, Mark replied, or to confuse predators. But as he studied the marks more closely, he frowned. The circle was wide, deliberate, and repeated twice. No randomness. The glider predator had walked the perimeter of the clearing with purpose. Mark stood and slowly turned, scanning the trees. This clearing is important to it. It wanted to check the perimeter before entering. Risa tilted her head, crest glowing faintly. To ensure safety? More than safety. Mark stepped forward, gesturing for them to follow. Creatures like this have instincts. If it circles something twice, it is significant. It might be a food source, a den, or something else it values. He approached a large tree at the far edge of the clearing. The bark was stripped in 4 parallel lines, high enough that only a tall creature could have caused them. At the base of the trunk, the soil was disturbed, but not in the way that indicated digging. Instead, it was compressed into a wide, shallow dent. Mark crouched to examine it. Joran leaned closer. What made that? The predator, Mark said. It sat here, or lay down, but not to rest. He pointed to the patterns around the dent. Broken lichen, scraped moss, tiny displaced stones. It stayed here for a while, watching. Risa's feathers stiffened. Watching what? Mark moved his gaze across the clearing, letting the evidence assemble itself silently in his mind. The bark patterns, the drag marks, the circular pacing. Something had drawn the creature here, but it did not remain in the center. It had evaluated the area and then positioned itself near the perimeter, where it had the advantage of sight and immediate escape routes. He stepped closer to the tree line opposite the ring of spirals. There, beneath a pair of intertwined roots, he saw a patch of moss that was not glowing. It had been torn away, ripped in a triangular pattern. He lifted it gently and studied the underside. What he saw made his breath slow. A tiny cluster of eggs, no bigger than stones, had been hidden beneath the moss. The creatures inside were not glider predators. Their shells were pale blue and coated in a crystalline sheen. Each egg pulsed faintly with bioluminescence, responding to the warmth of Mark's hand. Risaa gasped. "Nestlings," Joran tensed. "These are forest glimmerlings, highly territorial small predators. Their parents will be near." Mark replaced the moss covering gently. "The glider predator came here to avoid disturbing them. That is why it walked the perimeter twice. It knew this clearing was already claimed." Risaa stared at him in awe. "How do you know it was the glider predator that was cautious and not the glimmerlings?" Mark pointed at the drag marks circling the clearing. "The marks match the predator's tail structure. The glimmerling parents are much smaller. Their movement patterns would be concentrated near the nest, not around the clearing." Jorun inhaled slowly. "So the creature knew this clearing was dangerous." "Exactly," Mark said. "And it moved with caution. That means it changed direction after leaving the clearing. It would want to move away from the nest, not toward it. It would avoid confrontation." Risaa stood, scanning the clearing with her eyes rather than her device. "So where did it go next?" Mark walked to the opposite edge of the clearing, stepping over the circular tail marks with care. The moss here showed a different disturbance. Shallow, evenly spaced depressions in the shape of widened arcs. The arcs pointed toward a narrow break between two tall trees. "Here," Mark said. "This is where it left." Joran stepped beside him. "Those arcs, what are they?" "It's paws," Mark explained. "The glider predator landed lightly here after taking a long stride out of the clearing. The arcs indicate a directional push." Risaa leaned closer. "So it turned sharply and fled this way?" "Yes," Mark said. "It no longer moved cautiously. It accelerated once it put distance between itself and the nest." Risaa's feathers shimmered in anticipation. "Then we continue." Mark nodded. "But carefully. The parents of those glimmerlings might return, and they will not welcome us." Joran scanned the trees with his enhanced vision. "No movement yet. But we should hurry." With the path now identified, Mark led the way into the narrow break between the towering trunks. The moss gave way to rougher terrain, patches of stone, exposed roots, and dry clusters of leaves that crunched faintly. The air grew colder, and the faint luminescence of the clearing faded behind them. The forest seemed to hold its breath. The trio pressed forward, entering the dark corridor that the glider predator had chosen. The frequency of signs increased again: a snapped twig, a brush of crystalline residue, a disturbed line of earth, each fresher than the last. Mark felt the change instantly. The creature was no longer far ahead. It was nearby. Mark pausing at a steep rise of earth covered in thin moss, placing a finger against the ground and whispering, "It is close. Very close." For a moment after Mark spoke, none of them moved. The forest around the steep rise felt unnaturally still, as if even the spores had paused in midair. The moss under Mark's fingers held the faintest tremor from a recent disturbance, a tiny vibration trapped in memory. He pressed his hand more firmly into the ground and felt the residual warmth, not from sunlight but from muscle and blood that had passed over it minutes ago at most. He rose slowly, meeting Risaa's eyes first. Her crest feathers had dimmed with tension, and the pulsing glow along the edges of each filament betrayed the quickness of her heartbeat. Joran's 4 eyes were wide and focused, his shoulders slightly hunched as he shifted his weight to be ready for either movement or combat. "We need to think like the creature," Mark whispered. "Not like hunters who are chasing it, but like something that has been evaluating danger over every step." Risaa nodded once. "So it knows this corridor. It chose it for a reason." "Yes," Mark said. He looked up at the steep rise. Thin tree roots crisscrossed the slope, and patches of exposed stone peeked out between the moss. "It will not remain on open ground if it can help it. Not with a nest of glimmerlings behind it and unknown noises from the direction of the shuttle. It will pick a place where it can see before being seen. Joran's voice was low. High ground. Exactly, Mark answered. Which means it is ahead of us on the ridge. Watching. Risaa shifted uneasily. If it is watching, then it will know we are coming the moment we climb. Mark studied the angles. Unless we do not climb where it expects us to. He stepped back and scanned the slope again, but this time he looked past the obvious route. The center of the rise was clear of large obstacles, tempting anyone in a hurry to go straight up. On the left, however, the roots wove together more thickly and disappeared behind a bulging outcrop of stone. Mark moved that way, lowering himself close to the ground as he approached the root tangle. "What are you doing?" Risaa whispered. "If I were the predator, I would not stand at the very top of the open rise," he said quietly. "I would stand just off to the side, where I could retreat behind cover if needed, but still see anyone climbing." He slipped around the outcrop, letting the roots shield him. The soil here bore subtle signs. Bits of moss clinging to stone where something had brushed past, not at the center of the slope, but higher and to the right. He traced the line with his eyes. "There," he murmured. "It went up along the side, not the middle." Joran leaned close, his visor's internal lenses shifting rapidly. "The rock surface above that path holds a faint reflective smear." "Crystal contact," he said. "You are correct." Risaa glanced between them. "So if we climb along the center, it will see us clearly. If we take the side route, we might come up near its blind angle," Mark finished, "or at least closer to an equal position." He turned to Joran. "You climb last. Your weight will make the roots creak more. I will go first, Risaa behind me, then you." Joran nodded without argument. Risaa flexed her fingers, claws extending slightly as she prepared for the climb. "We are not going to attack it, are we?" she asked. "The goal is just visual contact." "We will not attack unless it attacks first," Mark said. "We give it room. It is not our enemy. It is just smarter than the Academy expected." He placed his hands on the nearest root and began to climb. The ascent was slow, each movement measured to avoid dislodging more moss than necessary. The roots creaked softly under his weight, but he chose his holds carefully, favoring places where the bark was already scuffed. Risaa followed, agile and light-footed, her claws sinking into the wood without cracking it. Joran came last, moving with surprising control for his mass, careful to distribute his weight. As Mark climbed, the air cooled even further. A faint current swept down from the ridge, carrying a scent that was more metallic than the forest's usual resin and soil. He recognized it now, the sharp, mineral tang of the glider predator's skin. Near the top, Mark slowed to almost a crawl. He paused with one hand gripping a root and one knee braced against a stone jut. Above him, the ridge leveled into a narrow platform that overlooked the corridor. A few low bushes grew there, their leaves trembling faintly. No wind brushed them. Something had moved behind them. He turned his head just enough to whisper, "Almost there. Move only when I move. And if I raise my hand, stop." Risaa flicked her crest once in acknowledgement. Joran grunted softly to show he understood. Mark eased upward until his eyes just cleared the ridgeline. The first thing he saw was not the predator. It was the view. From the ridge, the forest opened into a wider valley beyond, the canopy flowing like green waves, broken occasionally by dark stone spires. Sunlight pierced through in scattered shafts. From this vantage point, anyone, or anything, could see movement for a long distance, especially along the path the trio had just climbed. Then, between two thorned bushes, he saw it. The glider predator stood with its body stretched low and its legs tensed, half hidden by undergrowth. Its crystalline ridges along its spine gleamed faintly in the green light. Muscles flowed under its smooth, dark hide with the controlled tension of a creature that knew how to move without wasting effort. Its head was turned slightly to the side, one narrow eye fixed on the slope's central path where no one was currently climbing. Mark realized that if he had chosen that obvious route, he would now be directly exposed to that gaze. He stayed still, barely breathing. The predator flicked its tail, sending a faint ripple through the nearby leaves. It was close, no more than 5 or 6 paces away. Close enough that Mark could see the fine details of its paws, adapted more for grip and balance than force. He watched the subtle shifts of its weight, the way it inhaled slowly through slitted nostrils, sampling the air for clues. It had not yet noticed him. Mark did not want surprise to trigger an attack. He needed the creature to understand that he was not a threat. Very gently, he raised one hand, signaling Risa and Joran to halt. Then he cleared his throat, not loudly, just enough to place a sound in the open air. The predator's head snapped toward him. For a heartbeat, the world held only that gaze. The creature's eyes were unlike any hollow projection had suggested. In person, each iris held intricate veining, a constellation of pale lines radiating from a slit pupil, giving the impression of thoughtfulness rather than mindless instinct. The predator froze, every muscle coiled. Mark's heart hammered, but he kept his body as relaxed as he could. He lifted both hands slowly, palms outward, a universal sign of peace, even if the creature did not understand human gestures. He spoke quietly, his voice steady. "It is all right. We are not hunting you." The predator's tail twitched again. It shifted one paw backward as though preparing to bolt, but it did not. It sniffed, head tilting, ears flattening slightly. Risa's fingers dug into the root below Mark, but she did not move. Joran held perfectly still, his bulk pressed into the slope. Mark remained where he was, half exposed above the ridge, meeting the predator's gaze without staring aggressively. "We just needed to find you," he continued in the same calm tone. "That is all." Something in his lack of movement must have registered as non-threatening. The glider predator's posture eased a fraction, its shoulders lowered. Its head tilted to the other side, studying him with what looked almost like puzzled appraisal. It stepped sideways, not forward, giving itself room to sprint away if needed, but choosing not to take that option yet. In the silence that followed, the forest's usual sounds began to seep back in. Distant chittering, the soft hiss of spore clouds collapsing, a low murmur of shifting leaves. Mark realized that this moment, the fragile truce on the ridge, was exactly what the instructors had designed the test to avoid. The Academy had not expected any cadet to make it this far without frightening the creature into fleeing beyond sensor range. He knew that the challenge required visual confirmation. He had it. Now he just needed to leave without breaking the fragile balance. Slowly, he lowered one hand and tapped the recording control on his wrist device twice. The small device captured an image of the predator, framing it against the valley. A soft chime confirmed that the visual log was stored. The creature's ears flicked at the sound. Mark winced but kept his expression neutral. "Easy," he murmured. "Just a sound. We are finished." Risa risked a whisper from behind him. "Can you back away?" "Yes," Mark whispered back. Slowly. He shifted his weight, careful not to make any sudden moves. The predator watched each motion, but when he descended one step, it did not follow. Its tail swayed once more. Then it turned its head away from him, back toward the valley, as if dismissing him as a solved puzzle. When Mark reached a position just below the ridgeline, out of the predator's direct view, he allowed himself a breath. Risa's eyes were wide with restrained exhilaration. "You did it," she breathed. "We did it," Mark corrected. "You both trusted the route." Joran's deep chest shook with a quiet exhale that might have been a laugh. "I trusted the forest reader," he said. "Now we must return before another team claims credit for something less impressive." Mark smiled. "Let us go home, then." The descent was faster, but not careless. They retraced portions of their route with the help of the same signs Mark had used earlier, now easier to spot with familiarity. Risa found herself pointing out small disturbances before Mark could, proud of each correct interpretation. Joran grew adept at pairing his enhanced vision with Mark's logic, identifying subtle shifts in light and texture that confirmed the human's predictions. By the time the forest began to thin and the glassy clearing came into view, all three moved with the quiet confidence of those who had faced something genuinely challenging and come out changed. The shuttle waited in the same spot, its hull reflecting the muted sky. The instructor stood near the hollow pedestal, which now displayed a faint grid of tracking overlays, each line representing estimated movements of the glider predator based on standard models. Groups of cadets clustered in twos and threes around the perimeter, some seated, some pacing, all radiating frustration in posture and expression. Conversations quieted as Mark's team stepped out of the tree line. Several alien cadets turned to stare. One heavily armored student looked at Mark's clean, unadorned gear with open disbelief. Risa's crest flared with subtle pride, and Joran straightened to his full imposing height, but both let Mark walk slightly ahead. The instructor's reflective eyes tracked them as they crossed the clearing. "Cadets!" The baritone voice emerged from the collar. "You have returned. I note your timing. Few others have come back within this window." He tilted his head. "Report." Risa opened her mouth, then glanced at Mark. Mark lifted his wrist and projected the captured image. A three-dimensional recording sprang into the air above his forearm. The glider predator, poised between the thorned bushes on the ridge, its crystalline ridges glinting softly as it watched the valley. The image rotated gently for all to see. A murmur swept through the assembled cadets. One of them swore in disbelief. Another narrowed his eyes, then grudgingly nodded. The instructor stepped closer, examining the projection from multiple angles. "Proximity suggests a distance of fewer than 10 meters, he said. "Visual clarity is high. Timestamp indicates this recording was made less than 1 standard hour ago." He shifted his gaze to Mark. "Explain the method used to locate the target." Mark lifted his chin but did not exaggerate. "We followed environmental changes," he said. "Broken branches, disturbed moss, overturned leaves, small patterns in lichen and soil. We tried to understand how the creature avoided obvious tracks and looked for the side effects of that avoidance." Risa stepped forward. He read the forest as if it was writing. Once he showed us how, we began to see the same patterns. Eventually the trail was clear. Not simple, but clear. Joran nodded. No device could isolate these signs. Only pattern recognition and patience. The instructor's expression remained unreadable, but something in his stance changed. He turned to the other cadets. "How many of you relied primarily on scanners?" Almost every hand or equivalent limb rose. A few lowered halfway when their owners sensed the implication, but it was too late. The instructor returned his gaze to Mark. "No species in recorded Academy history has completed this exercise without technological assistance," he said. "You are the first to do so. You did not just track the predator. You predicted its behavior, avoided provoking it, and obtained a close visual without confrontation." He let that sink in, the silence thick with shifting pride and wounded egos. "Many of you evolved specialized organs for sensing heat, chemical traces, or subtle electromagnetic fluctuations," he continued to the group. "Humanity has none of these advantages, but evolution granted humanity something else in compensation: generalized interpretation. The ability to extract meaning from incomplete, indirect signs and apply those signs across unfamiliar environments." Mark felt heat rise to his face, embarrassment mingling with a reluctant satisfaction. Risa's feathers brushed his shoulder lightly, a gesture somewhere between camaraderie and acknowledgement. Joran's rumbling voice carried quietly. "The lesson is clear," he said. "Our strength in one area can blind us in others." The instructor inclined his head. "Cadet Mark Lyle, Cadet Risa Vergen, Cadet Joran Hal. You pass this module with distinction. Your work will be used in future curriculum adaptations." He paused. In particular, human tracking frameworks will be incorporated into joint training scenarios. A second murmur rippled through the group, this one more thoughtful than resentful. Mark exhaled slowly. He had not aimed to change curriculum. He had just wanted to prove that the forest could be read without numbers. Yet the result was the same. A new respect, tinged with curiosity, radiated from faces that had regarded him earlier as a baseline outlier. When the debrief ended, the cadets dispersed in smaller clusters, some heading toward the shuttle, others lingering to exchange impressions. Risaya remained beside Mark, her crest glowing in gentle pulses. "You know this story will spread through the academy," she said. "The test that no species could pass without tech, solved by a human who followed broken branches and moss trails." Mark shrugged, though a smile tugged at his mouth. "Good. Maybe next time someone listens to the ground before asking for a reading from a scanner." Jorun joined them, folding his arms across his broad chest. "When my people speak of navigation, we will mention this day," he said. "Caverns teach us to read stone. You have reminded us that the surface world has its own script." Mark looked past them, back toward the forest that ringed the clearing. The ridge was no longer visible from here, hidden by trees and mist, but he imagined the glider predator returning to its own routines, indifferent to what had happened except as another chapter in its personal map of danger and safety. "It was never about outsmarting it," Mark said quietly. "It was about paying enough attention to deserve seeing it." Risaya tilted her head. "You really believe the forest expects that?" "I believe everything around us is always talking," Mark answered. "We just choose which voices to ignore." Jorun let out another soft, rumbling sound that was almost a laugh. "Then perhaps the Academy will start offering a course in listening." The call to board the shuttle echoed across the clearing. As the trio walked toward it, Mark glanced back one last time at the tangled trees and the faint, living carpet of moss. The details were already blurring, the exact positions of broken twigs and bent fronds fading in his memory. But the skill, that way of seeing, remained, sharper than ever. He knew he would carry it into every future mission. On world after world, where scanners failed or data lied, he would remember that a snapped branch or a smudge of moss could reveal more truth than an entire array of instruments. By the time the shuttle lifted off, leaving the forest of Orinel 3 receding beneath them, the story had already begun to crystallize in the cadets' minds. No species could track the glider predator's vanishing footprints. No sensors could filter the noise of the forest. Yet a human had followed the faint language of broken branches and moss trails to stand face to face with what others could not even approach. It would not become a legend because it was dramatic. It would become a legend because it taught a quiet, enduring lesson. Sometimes the greatest advantage was not a powerful sense or a sophisticated device, but the simple, stubborn willingness to notice what everyone else believed was too small to matter.